Welcome everyone to our Digital Contracting for Net Zero series, where we explore with leaders in the field how legal teams are jumping into action to propel corporate climate action. Today, I'm joined by Phoebe Roberts, a superstar in this space. Welcome, Phoebe.
Thank you, Natalia.
It's great to have you on board. Phoebe is a senior legal practitioner in Minter Ellison's climate risk governance team and director of implementation and the APAC co-lead at the Chancery Lane Project, an extraordinary not-for-profit led by lawyers making significant waves for good in climate. More about TCLP shortly. Now, Phoebe, from your vantage point, let's start broad. What's happening around the grounds, and in particular, how are in-house legal and contract management teams in Australia stepping up to drive corporate net zero initiatives? And I'm curious, are KPIs being designed around this focus for legal teams? Hand over to you, Phoebe.
Thank you so much, Natalia, and it's amazing to be here today talking about my very favourite topic. You might need to rein me in at times because I can always talk about climate-aligned contracting until the cows come home. So first of all, I think it's really good to frame climate change. It's often talked about the risks of climate change, and I think that's where the legal team always gets pulled in on the transaction, at the end, or, once the commercial terms have been agreed, how do we manage risk? How do we allocate risk, which is what we use contracts for traditionally. I think with climate aligned contracting, particularly with assisting organisations to meet their net zero goals, the legal teams now have this very exciting role in helping organisations to capture some of the value and opportunities on the pathway to net zero, and actually having a seat at the table in helping to enable their organisation to, yes, protect against the accelerating risks of climate change, which I think we'll talk to in our conversation today, but also to be a very necessary part of the conversation about assisting their organisation to get to net zero. So what I think is really exciting about net zero drafting and climate aligned contracting is that the legal teams now have a very important role, and to reshift sometimes the perceptions that the legal team is sometimes just the thorn in the side and the one who's telling you don't do this or you need to pull back on what it is you want to do, but actually helping to accelerate action and using the power of contracts to help meet corporate goals. Now, in terms of KPIs, I can't speak too closely to that because I am a private practice lawyer through and through. But what I can say is that it is in the sense that we are reframing the role of the legal team and the way that legal team is collaborating with their commercial and technical counterparts in organisations. I think we're seeing this really exciting blurring of the lines of the pure legal role and allowing the private practice, in-house legal practitioners to step into more commercial objectives in their role and to reshape their role in how they're assisting their organisation to meet their corporate goals, which I think is very exciting.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent point. I mean, in-house legal teams, there's such pressure to become aligned with corporate strategy. Here is such a huge opportunity, right? And an area of visibility across organisations and investors, employees, customers. So such a huge opportunity. Can I ask you, where are you seeing most of the activity in relation to drafting contractual provisions for climate, perhaps by industry or transaction type?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to both of those, I think. So in terms of industries, I think there's probably two categories that the leaders in this space are falling into in terms of who's implementing climate aligned contracting, both from the risk side, but also the net zero implementation side. One are those first mover organisations, those who have really ambitious net zero targets or beyond net zero targets and have been leaders in the space for some time. And they, those organisations, for example, like Salesforce or NatWest, who are leaders in using the Chancery Lane Project clauses and are starting to infiltrate them through their supply chains and using their influence as a leader in the space to embed net zero targets, not only for their organisation, but with their counterparties and the and down their supply chain, which I think is really exciting. So there's those first movers, and I suppose tech is another one. Tech is an area where we're seeing that. Vodafone's another organisation that I can list that are using Chancery Lane Project clauses in their supply chain contracts.
So can we just stop there for a moment? You mentioned risk allocation, so lawyers having a role in relation to risk allocation and net zero. For newcomers to ESG and climate, can you please talk us through what you mean by risk allocation here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when we think about climate change, and this is how with my Minter Ellison hat on in the climate risk governance team, how we view climate change and how we advise our clients in respect of climate change related risks is really through a financial and liability risk lens. And what that means is that we unpack climate change, which I think can be quite a sort of big esoteric topic, and kind of break that down into the nuts and bolts. And I think to answer your question, what does that actually mean for particularly in-house lawyer sitting at my desk who might be drafting a contract? So when we're thinking about climate change risks, we think about the physical risks of climate change. So those are, I think, the risks that we can imagine sort of most readily. So those are the acute and catastrophic impacts of climate change, so floods, bushfires, and the like, but also those gradual onset changes that we're experiencing due to changing climate. So those are the gradual increases in hot days, more hot days, and how that's impacting on your business, rising sea levels, changes in weather patterns, such as more rainy days, as Sydney, and I know where you are, is experiencing a lot of in the past year and will over the next year, unfortunately. But these changes, I think, and is what we think about when we think about climate change, and it's the most easy to imagine. The thing about the physical risks of climate change is they are worsening over time. And with every degree of temperature increase that we're experiencing, those impacts are getting significantly worse. And that's what the updated science is telling us. For Australians, we're at a 1.4 degree increase over Australian land, which is 0.3 degrees higher than the global average. And that's due to the land mass and sort of where we sit on the equator. And that's looking like a 4 to 6 degree increase by the middle of the century, which obviously will have devastating impacts, which is why there's been this real global shift to accelerate emissions reduction as quickly as possible to 2050. So and that's why you've been hearing a lot about the climate, particularly since in the last year, since that landmark report was released. So when we are looking to decarbonise and shift our economy as quickly as possible, the economic transition risks, that's the second bucket of risk, is what we will experience as our economy is shifting to net zero, and hopefully in line with the Paris Agreement goals to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So if you think about those economic transition risks, it's really what is everything that needs to change in our economy to get to net zero. So the policy and regulatory changes, the technological changes, the consumer shifts, how investors are thinking about climate change, and how is your organisation then responding to those risks in addition to physical risks. So when we're thinking about it from the perspective of the legal team and as legal advisors and trusted advisors to our clients, we then help our clients to minimise the liability risks associated with those two buckets of risks, which really arise from the mismanagement of both physical and economic transition risks. And for corporates, that can be in directors' duties and breaches of directors' duties and disclosure requirements in relation to climate risks, but also contractual disputation, which is the topic that we're talking about today, delays to project approvals and negligence claims and nuisance and those types of things. So it's pretty broad, and I think the thing about climate risks is that it touches on and impacts on almost all types of corporate risk is impacted by climate change. So I think it's a good segue in to answer the second part of your first question around who is using climate aligned contracting. So there's I would think that I've mentioned earlier we have those first movers, those organisations who are taking big bold steps to get to net zero. and they're starting to think about how they can implement it in their supply chains. There are then those organisations who are sort of at the most scrutiny from institutional investors and shareholders around how they are implementing their net zero targets. And those organisations, mainly in energy and resources, those high emitters, but now financial services and financial institutions are sort of the next cab off the rank, who are by necessity having to start thinking about how they're credibly implementing their net zero targets. And so, of course, that is turning to their counterparty arrangements and implementing their net zero targets throughout their organisation is necessarily a big part of that. So what we've seen over the past sort of 18 months is the focus has shifted squarely from you need to set a net zero target, and I want an ambitious net zero target, but how are you actually meeting that net zero target? And that is where the legal teams come in.
Fantastic. And how, as a legal team, will you go about drafting net zero provisions, climate provisions within contracts? Like, how would you take a strategic approach here? Could we start from scratch?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'll start maybe with sort of the team approach before I get into the nitty-gritty of actually some drafting tips. But I think the first starting point, and this applies just broadly to think about climate risk for your organisation, is capacity building. So it's really important that the legal team, the project teams, your commercial and technical teams all have a baseline understanding of climate change and how that impacts on your role and your projects. You don't have to be an absolute specialist. You don't need to know everything that there is to know about climate change, but just to know enough to be dangerous, just to know when to think about, that feels like something we might need to be thinking about, or there might be an opportunity there. I think is really important, and ensure that everyone in the organisation, particularly those who are dealing with contractual risk allocation, are across the issues. They know what a physical risk is. They know what the key economic transition risks are for the business. The second tip, and particularly in terms of thinking about how the organisation might be, updating their precedents or their contract life cycles or procurement processes, is collaboration between not just the legal team, but also their commercial and technical counterparts, and particularly the risk professionals within the organisation. So it's not something that can be achieved in a silo. So, whilst the legal team is skilling up on how to implement these changes through the contractual mechanisms, the risk team will also be thinking about how to update the risk management frameworks and the risk response inside the organisation. And those two things should really marry up. So collaboration with the risk team, the commercial teams, the technical teams, depending on what type of organisation you're in, to ensure that the left hand speaking to the right hand, and that necessarily a lot of, not all of it, but a lot of the drafting around climate and net zero is quite technical. You're setting specifications and targets around what you or your counterparty are seeking to achieve. And so it's really important to have really good, strong relationships and links in with the commercial and technical teams. The last bit, I think that's really important when you're thinking about this, when I say this, I mean incorporating climate risk and net zero into contracts, is to ensure that the process is credible and that you can stand behind what is being put into the contracts, particularly in this heightened landscape with activist shareholder resolutions and claims. And, these don't even need to get to court for there to be huge reputational impacts.
Yes.
And to ensure that these, to ensure that they're credible. So maybe you're not ready to have the most ambitious targets in there, but does your contract allow you to ratchet up your ambition over time? Are there mechanisms in there for you to come together with counterparties to do better? If you've got an innovation in one part of your business, can you take it to another part of your business? And just using the contracts to your advantage. I think I'll also add in there that when you are collaborating with your commercial and technical teams, it's also really important to take this sort of open collaborative approach with your counterparties, particularly those who may not be as progressed on their net zero journey, may not have the capability, particularly for SMEs or other smaller suppliers you might work with, to build everyone up with you, and that you can actually use your contractual relationships to do that.
This is a great point, a great time to ask you, Phoebe, about the Chancery Lane Project. You're doing fantastic work, and I love being part of your team with the translation of clauses from other jurisdictions into Australia, full of guidance notes, just such a rich resource. So as legal teams move on this climate action journey and supporting their organisations, how do they use the TCLP resources? Some tips along those lines will be fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who are listening who don't know what the Chancery Lane Project is, we are a collaborative global project of over 1,500 lawyers now who've come together to rewire contracts and really to answer the question, what is the role of the transactional lawyer here in the transition to net zero? And really to think how powerful it would be if every single corporate contract embedded and enabled solutions to climate change. So we have, as a group of lawyers, collaboratively drafted over 100 climate clauses across a whole range of corporate sectors, and I would say the entire contract lifecycle. So from pre-contract terms, RFP terms, through to delivery terms, termination, across all different types of sectors. We've got governance, risk, insurance clauses, you name it. So not only do we have these clauses that have been drafted by commercial lawyers and then put through an expert peer review process across the top 25 law firms in the UK, but we also have a user guide that sits behind every single one of those clauses, which sets out the climate issue that the clause is seeking to address, the key challenges that you might face in implementing that clause, giving you the option to kind of copy and paste those into your emails to, try and, get either your business or your counterparties across the line and understanding and trying to preempt some of those issues, and give you drafting notes and other guidance about how you might go about implementing those clauses.
One of the things I love about the resource, the clauses within the TCLP clause base, is the fact that you have providers of light touch clauses to heavy touch for various types of contracts, and it brings to bear that point you made earlier about the need to collaborate and perhaps understand the appetite of counterparties to transact. And if you can talk a bit about the way in which the database of clauses has been structured to support different levels of maturity.
Absolutely. So there's a number of clauses in the Chancery Lane Project database, or clause bank, as we call it, that really don't even need to impact on risk return ratios at all. So, for example, a clause that can be put into an NDA to ensure that climate matters are being considered alongside a commercial purpose. We've got recitals that can sit in the front of any type of corporate contract, which again doesn't need to impact on the delivery or the commercial terms or risk allocation, really sets the tone of the intention of the parties about their mutual climate goals and what they're seeking to achieve in their counterparty arrangements. And the clauses the clauses all align or have been mostly updated to align. So when they were first drafted, they were climate clauses, and they went through a process in the lead up to COP last year to take majority of our clauses and ensure that they were aligned with a net zero pathway in accordance with the Paris Agreement goals, and to ensure that they were as rigorous as possible. We have tools that sit alongside our clauses, so that if you're looking at a certain clause, and let's just, as an example, say one of our supply chain clauses, that might filter down a net zero target down your supply chain. Alongside that, we have our net zero dashboard and net zero drafting checklist, which show you the ambition of a net zero target across the key categories of a net zero target, showing you what low to high ambition might be, so that you can make the tweaks that you need to across the drafting, across the clause. And just that the TCLP clauses in their current form are the most ambitious, and they allow lawyers within their team to then to scale that back in a way that is not greenwashing and is not diluting climate impact, but is meeting the counterparties where they are. and ensuring that they can actually start to take those steps to increase ambition over time. And I think one of the most exciting things about climate aligned drafting, from my perspective, is using traditional, not even needing to use Chancery Lane Project clauses, but using traditional clauses that we all know and love to embed some of these mechanisms to help organisations to navigate the risk pathway to net zero, that to be able to navigate issues as they pop up. So, for example, ensuring that there's really good, strong governance measures in the contract. How are you reporting to each other? How often do you come together to discuss matters under the contract? Are the parties required to talk about climate and net zero at their regular catch-ups, or however they're managing the relationship during the contractual arrangement? Same with data collection, which is often the first step on a net zero journey. As we know, you can't manage what you don't measure. Yeah. So just ensuring that parties are collecting information in a consistent manner, and enabling them also to then use that with their financiers when they want to access green finance, to show that they're already collecting data on emissions and how they're going to manage that over time. And so that, I think, is really a good first step. But it's also, there's TCLP clauses, as I was mentioning, that don't impact on risk allocation. For example, a good one, there's two that I think are a good example of this to help navigate economic transition risks in particular, is Iris's clause, which is a sort of amendment to a traditional force majeure clause that allows the parties to also consider the adverse environmental impacts of something, an act of God, although can we call these an act of God anymore? We have the updated climate science telling us what's coming. And also there's in the construction context, there's a clause called Luna's clause, which I think is a good example to demonstrate just using a traditional clause that's been amended for net zero, which is a net zero modifications clause in a construction context. So ensuring that the contractor and the principal can come together and propose an amendment to the works or a variation to the works, which is a very unusual process under the contract, but ensuring that there's a contractual mechanism to reflect and it's sort of to create the circumstances where the parties will actually have a conversation about whether or not to take that on board to assist them to meet their net zero goals, if there might be a lower emissions pathway to achieving the completion of the works.
So Phoebe, I'm wondering, could you please share, where is it that lawyers may stumble, or where are the particular challenges in negotiating climate-related aligned provisions with counterparties, and some tips on how to avoid these challenges?
Absolutely. Great question. So I think one of the biggest challenges in implementing climate-aligned contracting is that everyone is under enormous pressure at the moment in particular. There's supply chain issues, there's capacity issues in delivering, supply chain issues, and this just feels like sometimes like, just let me add something else to the lawyer's to-do list to help implement climate goals, which might be seen as a bit wishy-washy. And I think that continuing on with this business as usual approach to drafting is what sometimes can be seen as a barrier, as just this internal resistance. And I think one of the real tips to overcome this perceived resistance is that it's actually to reframe it as this is a key and material risk issue that we need to address that has significant financial consequences. So if we're not pricing in and allocating the risk of these, both from physical and economic transition risk perspective, but also not meeting our net zero targets and ensuring that this supply or this delivery or this construction or this lease, whatever it might be, isn't assisting us to meet our net zero targets now, we'll be paying for it in the future, because we're going to need to find a greener lease and get out of the one that we're currently in. We're going to need to navigate how we can go to a lower carbon supplier. And so really the role is to help those who might be, seeing the perspective of trying to keep things with business as usual, that actually these are these are issues that have financial consequences for the business, and that we really need to start baking them in now, just like any other risk. And it's not that these risks are more sort of bigger than any other risk that the business might be facing, but to take a very sensible approach to what does this mean for this site? What does this mean for this supply? And we just need to incorporate it like we do any other risk.
Fantastic. What are your tips in relation to how you structure, or where do you start as far as type of contracts within an organisation? How do you determine what type of clauses will have the greatest impact for your organisation?
Yeah, great question. So before I answer that one, I think if you're stepping back and looking at your entire contract life cycle, and let's use a procurement example, just I think to keep it simple. The only way that you will get your climate aligned or net zero clauses into that contract, despite what type it might be, what type of clause it might be, is if the net zero requirements and those targets, if that's what you're trying to implement, are incorporated from the very earliest stage of that procurement cycle or that contract life cycle. So it must be in the business case. And if it's not in the business case, it's going to make it very hard to get into RFP terms. And if it's not in the RFP terms, it's going to be very hard to choose which contractor or supplier you might go with, because it's not weighted in the evaluation criteria. And if it's not weighted in the evaluation criteria, how can you then expect the supplier to implement or meet net zero targets if they weren't made aware of it until contract signing time? So my first tip is really for any of these types of clauses is just to make sure that it's been incorporated from the very earliest stages of the supply or the project, and that it's really the climate aspect. So whether it's the net zero targets or it's carbon budgets is really thought of as important in the procurement as the time, quality and cost metrics that are also included. Because as we mentioned, it can have really significant financial impacts further down the line if you're trying to navigate a lower emissions pathway, but you're locked into a high emitting contract or scenario. And to some of the contracts that we enter into, that we might be locked into for 10 to 15 years into the future. So that would be my first tip, is to really just zoom out and to make sure that you are including it as early as possible. I think there's a little bit of a tension going on in the market at the moment, where a lot of organisations are realising they need to get this into contracts, but the RFP's already gone out, and then the lawyers are trying to now sort of through the back end put this stuff in. So that on behalf of all legal teams, that's my number one request. And then when it comes to the types of clauses that you might want to start including, as I've mentioned, the data collection and governance are a really good place to start. As I've mentioned, they don't need to impact on risk return allocations, and they really set both parties up for success in increasing their ambition and ensuring that they can reduce emissions over time and help to navigate some of those issues that might pop up. The next category, I would say, is similar to Luna's clause, which I mentioned earlier, and that those types of clauses that allow the parties to ratchet up ambition. Again, they don't need to impact on risk return ratios now. You can include these clauses in the contract to allow parties to choose to do better and to have the option to scale up as there's new innovations in the market, as there might be policy changes and those types of things. And then the third is really around those clauses that assist you to really deliver on your net zero targets, and those are the more operative clauses. And I think some good examples is Owen's clause, which is one of the Chancery Lane Project clauses that cascades your net zero target into your supply chain. And also there's two ways to think about this. You can have a net zero target for that very specific supply or that product and include a budget for that particular thing that you are, or the subject matter of the contract. Or depending on the type of organisation you are, particularly if you're a large organisation that might be particularly influential and have a really big pool of suppliers that you work with regularly. And I think Salesforce is a good example of this, and this is how they've used TCLP clauses, is to use your contractual relationships to influence how your supply chain does business, and to ensure that they, requesting that they get their house in order when it comes to climate risk, so that, they are also setting aligned net zero targets that are aligned with Paris Agreement, and so forth, so that you're ensuring that the parties that you're interacting with have their climate credentials sort of in line with what your expectations are. So whether you're doing it at the supply level or the contractor level. The other thing to think about, which I think would be my final tip, is to think about how these clauses are being enforced. So one sort of key issue, if your supply doesn't meet your specified standard, or goes over budget from a carbon perspective, what recourse do you have under the contract? And often the answer would be none. So to think about how we can have some more creative ways of ensuring that parties are actually meeting those metrics, and taking more of a carrot than a stick approach. So can you link those KPIs to the finance and the finance arrangements for the contract, and also you might get access to a lower cost of capital by linking the green metrics in the contract to those to the financing of the project. There's a whole lot of green capital in the market at the moment, just looking for opportunities to implement it. So can you capitalise on that while at the same time ensuring that your contract is actually going to meet those KPIs? And again, I'm feeling like a broken record, but ensuring that you do have open lines of communication and good governance in your contractual frameworks to ensure that you're, checking in, there's progress reports on carbon and all those types of things, and perhaps putting in some pain share, gain share mechanisms.
Fantastic. Can you give me one example of your most exciting, most creative consequences or carrot that you've seen offered and negotiated within contractual provisions?
Absolutely. One of my favourite TCLP clauses, and I think this was one of the ones that really got me over the line in thinking, wow, there's something here, and really how I feel like very lame when I say a sentence like this, but the power of contracting and the role that contracts have in the pathway to net zero is termination for a greener supplier. So what this type of provision does is it gives the customer the opportunity to go to their supplier and with a counter offer from an alternative supplier who can demonstrate to them how they can supply the same or similar product, but with a lower emissions profile or other metrics. And it doesn't give the customer the right to just terminate because the other party can do better against those metrics, but it offers the supplier the opportunity to meet those targets and to do better and to show how they can reduce emissions or whatever else it might be in line with that customer, that competitor. And then the customer, if they're unable to do that, the customer then has the option to then move to the alternative supplier. And what I really love about that type of provision is it's not just about like cutting a party loose if they're not meeting your targets or divesting from a bigger picture if we're looking at it from that angle, but it really is about ensuring that you're lifting up your supply chain and counterparty with you on the net zero journey. And in doing so, you've increased the performance of not just your supplier, but hopefully they'll then take that to their other customers once they've found a way to do it in a lower emissions way. So that's one of my favourite clauses because, it drives better performance on both sides.
Fantastic. One last question. What does the future hold in this space? Like in 3 to 5 years' time, what evolution do you expect to see in relation to contractual provisions on climate?
Yeah, so I think right now it's in its infancy in a sense. I think what we're experiencing at the moment is traditional risk allocation and precedent approaches to contracting are not currently addressing these unprecedented risks. And organisations are finding that their contracts that they're using just aren't fit for purpose in this very dynamic risk landscape that we find ourselves in. So where I see climate aligned contracting going over the next 3 to 5 years, and then particularly from 2030 onwards, as physical risks accelerate and as economic transition risks accelerate, that it will just become business as usual because it necessarily has to be, and that climate aligned contracting is not going to be a specialist area, but really just a fundamental part of all legal teams, because it's about managing risk, and this is categorically the largest risk that organisations will be facing in the near future and right now. So my final point would be to say that climate change, it's not a 2030 problem or a 2050 problem. It's actually a 2020 problem. It's already here, and your organisation is already paying for it in some way. And then what can your role be as the in-house lawyer to help shift the dial and ensure that your organisation is properly protected against these accelerating risks?
What a fabulous way to end this webinar. You're such a trailblazer. I really love your work in this area, especially with the Chancery Lane Project. It's just such a fabulous initiative. I would love to just end with a quote from Bill McKibben. As Bill put it, climate change is the single biggest thing that humans have ever done on this planet. The one thing that needs to be bigger is our movement to stop it. Thank you once again, Phoebe. You're brilliant. I'm Natalia Sonimarkovic, Fellow with the Centre for Legal Innovation. Till next time.